By now, we have a rough idea how the story of cinema goes. Everyone knows the basics of early cinema and how that transitioned into modern and then contemporary cinema, and we fill in the gaps with the most important eras and regions of film in a simple chronology. We typically use these movements to craft a timeline of cinema, those conscious decisions, often made by collectives of filmmakers and artists that seek to work toward the same goal. We've had the school of Soviet montage, the Nouvelle Vague, Dogma 95, and within all of these movements stood an array of filmmakers and theorists that aim to mould the cinematic landscape through new modes of thought. Manifestos were written, rules were established, and for many of them, these were the new and absolute methods to alter our vision of film.
And then I read the manifesto, and then they asked me questions, and I said I was allowed by the brothers to read the manifesto, but not to discuss it. I thought that was very clever.
But what is the best moment in cinema? Now, this is obviously subjective. When you're dealing with the masters of any craft, it can ultimately come down to personal taste. So then perhaps the question should be, at what point was there the greatest concentration of filmmakers? And what if the era that I proposed wasn't part of a movement at all? That they did not consciously come together? That they were products of circumstance and environment that encouraged them to create their greatest works? An environment that had altered so drastically in such a short period that there was no choice but to create something equally as altering. This is the story of a 10-year period in Japan, wherein concentrated within a single country were some of the greatest filmmakers to ever live, simultaneously producing their greatest works. The result was a complete decentralization of classic cinema as the world was exposed to its new troupe of masters. It didn't have a name and it wasn't planned, but it's most often thought of as the golden age of Japanese cinema. There isn't exactly a specific date that we can refer to as the golden age of Japanese cinema, because it's not a canonized idea within cinematic chronology. It's more of a colloquial terminology. But for the sake of categorization, we think of the golden age as the 1950s. So why then is it perceived as a golden age, an age of magnificent quality beyond all other ages? Well, for one, it's because the greatest filmmakers of Japan made their magnum opuses within this decade. Kurosawa made Seven Samurai, Ozu made Tokyo Story, Kinugasa made Gate of Hell, Inagaki made the Samurai Trilogy, and I could go on and on. It's an era of quality for the nation that supersedes all others, one of unparalleled excellence. But this reputation has in truth become mythologized in the eyes of film historians as though it was some divine miracle that Japan all of a sudden became the epicenter of such a rich cinematic culture. So let's clarify something about this. The Japanese Golden Age is commonly thought of as the starting point for great Japanese cinema. Everything that was to follow was in the footsteps of these new masters. The truth is, in Japan, the filmmakers that make up the Golden Age were already known. In fact, filmmakers like Ozu, Mizoguchi, and Naruse had been making films for around 30 years. Although it remains true that most filmmakers produced their best work within this period, it was more so that Japanese filmmakers did not have the means to be recognized on the world stage. It's a rather egregious reality, and to give a comparison, an equivalent would be if Martin Scorsese did not get global recognition until around the year 2000. This is the kind of narrative that we're accepting if we believe that the Golden Age emerges from a vacuum. The fact of the matter is, you can only truly understand this decade of film when you understand what came before it. You have to begin setting the stage for this era with its historical context, because without it, the Golden Age most likely doesn't exist. At the end of World War II, Japan was exposed to a harsh realization of its position on the global stage. Its landscape had been annihilated by the atomic bomb, resulting in the surrender of the Japanese. the infallible and divine Emperor Hirohito formally renounced his divinity after the unthinkable surrender, revealing himself to be human after all. This horrifying realization for the Japanese people, that the guise of everything that they believed they were, collapsed in a matter of moments. Their sacred right to rule supreme had fallen, and the veneer of such a global dominance was swiftly wiped away. After the end of the war, Japan was left with the reality that they were an ethnically homogeneous and culturally unified unit that did not fit in with the new democratic world. And although we can't ignore the collective psychological toil placed upon a nation after losing the most deadly war in history, and how that certainly had some effect on what it produced, it was what came directly following the war that actively impacted Japanese cinema. Japan was now occupied by the United States. During the Allied occupation of Japan, the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers was responsible for controlling and suppressing any Japanese military nationalism. This position was referred to in Japan as GHQ, or General Headquarters. Now, two of the subsidiaries of GHQ were specifically responsible for media control of Japan during this period, CIE and CCD. And the members that made up these bodies were not government officials nor artistic consultants, they were all military personnel. This meant that there was a military censorship operation that took control of the entire Japanese film industry from 1945 until 1952. This meant for any Japanese filmmaker during this period, every concept and screenplay had to be fully translated into English and run through these two bodies of censorship. And this rule applied to every film. Many filmmakers suffered because of this. Makino Masahiro stopped making films altogether during this period, and director Takasa Tomotaka was recuperating from being poisoned by radiation in Hiroshima. Now bear in mind, as I mentioned, this was still during the careers of these masters, many of them at the height of their career. And now, this great collective has to have their work suppressed and censored by an outsider force. One of the few other periods in cinema which can match the saturation of filmmakers that came from Japan is probably the US cinema of the 1970s. But can you imagine a completely different culture dictating what could be made by Scorsese, Coppola and Spielberg? It would be a travesty to do such a thing, which ultimately it was. So what were the laws regarding censorship during this period? Well, in November of 1945, the head of the CIE, David Conde, listed 13 things that were to be banned from all Japanese cinema. These included nationalism, patriotism, revenge stories, and finally any film that opposed GHQ directives, which ultimately meant that they were at liberty to ban and censor anything that they felt they should. This level of censorship meant that what distinguished revolting Japanese sentiment and Japanese culture became blurred. For instance, any depiction of a katana was not allowed, and GHQ took extreme care for any imagery that could evoke Japanese national sentiment to be prohibited. As a consequence of this, when Makino Masahiro wanted to depict Mount Fuji, it was deemed a nationalist symbol and told that he couldn't. Even bowing, which has feudal connotations, was considered an issue by the censors. Even the great films of the masters that were released in this era were subject to the same harsh standards. Late Spring by Ozu originally had a line in which the father states that Tokyo is still filled with bomb sites. After the censorship, he now says, "Kyoto wa ii desu ne, nonbiri shitete. Tokyo ni wa konna toko arimasen yo. Okorittokutte." The hands of the Japanese were firmly tied. They had no choice but to abide by the new directives. And so it was during this period of censorship that filmmakers were incredibly limited as to what type of films they could make. The idea films were pushed to the forefront as films that could promote American individualism and democratic ideas that fell in line with the Hollywood standard of the time. A few years ago, they were ordered to make films to boost Japanese militarism, and now they were ordered to do the exact opposite. The filmmakers of Japan were used as tools for propaganda. All sense of their cultural identity was becoming slowly absorbed by the American democratic machine. The United States aimed to instill its own values onto Japan through its cinema, part of the reverse course operation. Now, the landscape of cinema differed much more than the fluidity of styles that we have today. This was still in the era of genre films, and the genre films of the Japanese were as specific as they were in the West. The most prevalent genre film was the Jidaigeki, which we would essentially think of as a period film. A subgenre of this, and the most popular, would be the Chanbara, which is the samurai film. However, because of the censorship, no fealty to feudalism and no nationalist iconography was to be used in these films, and so the Jidaigeki was completely dismissed. If you ever wonder why there's a large gap of period films within Japanese cinema, it's because the censorship period made it impossible by law to produce them. There was ultimately no other option. Every film had to be a shomingeki, which is a common person drama, because also that was the position that everyone was in, a common person struggling with modern life. So why isn't this era a more discussed period within cinema? The US essentially committed subterfuge to promote Western propaganda and inhibit Japanese voices. Well, it's because this censorship was supposed to be completely hidden. This covert censorship not only was impacting the present-day cinema in Japan, but they sought to retroactively reshape Japanese cinema by attacking its history. In 1946, some 500 movies were selected of Japanese cinema that were deemed taboo, and it's expected that around half of them were burned. Some of the larger studios took the preemptive measure of burning their own works that they felt would have failed these measures, as they were preparing to be punished as a type of low-level propagandist for the Japanese war effort. Many of the films were passed over to the Library of Congress, but with no listing or cataloguing of what was chosen in the 1946 burning, no one is entirely certain as to what was and what wasn't destroyed at this time. When you examine the filmographies of the master filmmakers of Japanese cinema, what you'll notice is that an extensive portion of their early work is completely missing. Compared to filmmakers from every other continent of the same era, there's no comparison. Fritz Lang, who fled Germany due to Nazi persecution, has a surviving filmography. One can only assume the breadth of masterpieces that were destroyed in a single act of military censorship. Who knows how the narrative of cinema would differ with these films still intact? And so you have all of these restrictions on the innate Japanese culture. The masters of the craft inhibited as to what they can make, and the country exposed to a variety of foreign customs, such as American animation, which had been previously banned by the emperor. The result was a rapidly shifting cultural milieu. And the shift in mindset is perhaps best exemplified in the banned film of the time, A Japanese Tragedy, where the once mighty Hirohito fades into a salary worker. The image reflective of how the once ardent Japanese, it would now seem, must submit to its new cultural sovereign. But hope was on the horizon. Towards the end of the Allied occupation, the restrictions of the military censorship gradually started to wane. This leads to the agreed point in which film historians refer to for when Japanese cinema was, quote, discovered. The Venice Film Festival, 1951. It's at this festival Rashomon by Kurosawa is screened without the director's knowledge. It wins the Golden Lion. It also goes on to receive an Academy Award that same year. From that point on, every single festival lineup prioritizes Japanese cinema. The censorship ends, and the golden age of Japanese cinema blossoms. So it was just one film that spurred on this renaissance of cinema? Of course not. However, Rashomon is undoubtedly the unanimous starting point. The film was remarkably original. Kurosawa implemented a brand new narrative structure, telling stories within a story and highlighting a perspectivism within film which perhaps hasn't been matched to this day. A single story told from 4 different points of view, and how each person tells the story differently. Kurosawa also announced himself with a bold and expressive directing style, a constantly moving camera shooting directly into the sunlight. This was an exciting and new cinematic language. The film festival circuit would prove crucial, as over the next decade, the awards season became saturated. Golden Lions, Academy Awards, and Palme d'Ors awarded to Japanese films. From 1951 onwards, countries outside of Japan were first exposed to Japanese cinema. And what undeniably helped the cause was that a large portion of them were period dramas. After the dissolution of the censorship, there was an onslaught of jidaigeki films, the type of films that would become so intrinsic to Japanese cinema and exactly the kind of thing that they'd been unable to make for the past several years. There were Orientalist desires from Western audiences at the time which aimed to be satiated by such films. Nagata Misaichi, the head of Studio Daiei, felt that period films would be much more appealing for foreigners, and so during this period made a conscious effort to produce more films within the jidaigeki genre. And it worked. It's why many more social realist filmmakers that operated in the gendaigeki genre, such as Ozu, didn't receive such a reputation until many years later. And so most of the revered films of this period were built upon those traditional genre films that preceded it. And it was the Western exposure to these films that helped in finally giving these artists the platform that they deserved. What we also have to realize during this period is that this era of Japanese cinema that we think of as the Golden Age was also the period of mass-produced studio films. Whereas most countries failed to capitalize on the Hollywood studio system that had made the US so successful, Japan actually were able to implement a similar system, even mirroring Hollywood studios with their own Big Five. These were Toho, Daiei, Shochiku, Nikkatsu, and Toei. However, the fact of the matter is that back then, studios could only increase their chances of success by making the greatest films that they possibly could. And so these 5 studios hired the best artists of the time and gave them the financial backing and creative freedom that they needed. The result was that the studios made a lot of money, the filmmakers created an abundance of masterpieces, and the golden age of Japanese cinema meant that people filled the theatres. To give an idea of the growth of their film industry, in 1946, at the beginning of the censorship, Japan had 1,376 theatres. In 1952, once the Golden Age had begun, this increased to 4,109. And by 1960, at the end of the age, this number was 7,457. The studios were capitalizing on the public's desire for the Japanese perspective, and they sought to appease this by saturating the market with only the best. Toho, as the most popular studio, had major focuses in its release schedule. Outside of the regular comedy releases that they had, the director to which they gave their primary attention was Kurosawa. Kurosawa was known as the father of the samurai film, although a more appropriate envisioning of his role was that he resurrected the genre. There were a plethora of pre-war samurai films. However, Kurosawa came with his own transgressions on the perceptions of Bushido. Rather than having samurai that were absolutely subservient to a code, we saw them as heroes, but oftentimes they were selfish, other times they were rebels. The cornerstone to his approach is that for the first time, the samurai was seen foremost as human. He delved into character psychology and removed them from the traditional archetypes of the past. And during the peak of his career, when you thought of Kurosawa, you would either think of men with swords or men with suits. What Kurosawa did for cinema as a whole was what most filmmakers hope at some point to do, and that is to bridge the gap between one's artistry and mainstream appeal. For all intents and purposes, Kurosawa was making art house cinema. Rashomon was altering the very structure of narrative film, and throughout the decade, most of his films were adaptations of Dostoevsky and Shakespeare. However, Kurosawa re-envisioned art house cinema as something not denoted with the intellect, but one that was purely sensorial. While he was moulding cinematic language with his radical new aesthetic, he was captivating his audiences, with Seven Samurai ending the year as the top-grossing film in Japan. Kurosawa's filmmaking brought an unseen kinetic energy to film, utilising long lenses that give a shallower depth to his backgrounds, multiple moving cameras within a single scene, and rapid editing often juxtaposed with slow-motion sequences. Movement is the principal factor within Kurosawa's frames, and the grandiose maximalism of his images testify to this grand feat of movement. Although taking much inspiration from Western filmmakers, it would come full circle, as Kurosawa's work would become instrumental for the Western genre. Kurosawa shot and edited as he went along, giving his films a three-dimensionality. Take any frame from Kurosawa and watch how he guides motion in the most dramatic fashion. His wipe transition was what Guy Deleuze called the breath that wipes away the void. It brought an equalising factor between everything on screen. Although it's a story about warriors, it's also about the humble person. Kurosawa, with all of his grandeur, still focused on the human being first. And although Kurosawa was and remains the most well-established, well-regarded, and highly distributed Japanese filmmaker in the West, he was one of just many filmmakers worthy of recognition and study during this decade. Many of the studios had their own filmmaker that served as a contractor director and became a staple name. Beginning at Toho before moving to Daiei, Kenji Mizoguchi became their most important figure. And as stated earlier, although having an expansive career prior to the censorship, Daiei ensured that his newest projects emphasized the Jidaigeki genre. During the censorship, Mizoguchi perhaps navigated the restrictions better than most, but all of his films following its collapse were historical films, until his death shortly after, in 1956. Mizoguchi was not like Kurosawa, and rather emphasized the space in his images. His camera too was constantly moving. However, rather than the rapidity of Kurosawa's movement, Mizoguchi's was slow and ethereal. He traversed his spaces in a ghostly manner, as though the space was somewhere transient. This matched the thematics in which he garnered most interest. In Ugetsu, it's between life and death. The gaze of Mizoguchi is a transcendental one, as the women of his films are viewed as some otherworldly mystical entity. When you think of Mizoguchi, you think of panoramic cameras, clearly demonstrated as he was most inspired by the Imakimono painting style. There are no close-ups in his work, as he focuses on the impermanence of things through his spacious and spiritual imagery. Mizoguchi is the director responsible for some of the most human films. those that juxtapose the plight of human suffering with the boundless depth of human love. Meanwhile, at Shochiku, they were responsible for the distribution of Ozu films. Ozu was the creator of the home drama, whose films were the simplest and the quietest of the three directors, and whose style was unflinching throughout the entirety of his career. Static cameras, characters speaking directly into the lens, and an emphasis on composition through the geometry of traditional Japanese architecture. His films are quiet and exemplify the Japanese way of living, capturing the transient and most fleeting of human emotions through the depiction of the Japanese family structure. Although not as grandiose as Kurosawa, nor as spiritual as Mizoguchi, Ozu epitomizes a sentimentality that perhaps has not been as well achieved by any other filmmaker to this day. These are often thought of as the champions of classic Japanese cinema. However, they are just the surface level of a rich and thriving industry. Toho also had Mikio Naruse, who was too creating his best work during this era, and Kobayashi was releasing the Human Condition trilogy, just to point out how rich this period of time was in producing great films. Michiko, but like many moments in history, the rise of Japanese cinema also benefited from nothing other than good fortune. In 1951, at almost the same time as the emergence of Japanese cinema as a unique force, Cahiers du Cinéma launches its first issue. Led primarily by the writings of André Bazin, as well as his quasi-apprentices such as François Truffaut, it's during the 1950s that they examine the cinema of the United States and begin to reappraise its filmmakers, such as the work of Alfred Hitchcock and John Ford. They propose that although they were popular directors working under a studio system, their unique brand of cinematic language was based in innovation. Although the studio system wanted certain things, this didn't have much impact on the creative decisions that made their works so idiosyncratic. In the March issue of 1957, Bazin also writes a similar thing about Kurosawa, saying that upon a retrospective of his work, this has allowed us to revise our opinion of Kurosawa, who was quite inadequately known in France by only 2 films, Rashomon and The Seven Samurai. Kurosawa was the first among many who was to be re-examined as a studio filmmaker that still held individual creative freedom. This notion in cinema was auteur theory, the idea that a filmmaker had such a distinctive approach that there's an unmistakable character placed upon their films, and whereas previous filmmakers unofficially had had the moniker of an auteur applied, now there were emerging an array of contemporary, unheard of artists that were equally applicable to the theory. Perhaps the most astounding aspect of this period comes with this notion of varying auteurs, because when the works of the Japanese directors are examined, each director offers such a unique and distinctive style. You couldn't class the works of the Japanese Golden Era into a cohesive movement because the styles were so radically different from one another. Ozu cherished his self-imposed restrictions. Kurosawa did everything to break free of any and all restrictions. And the fact of the matter is that their filmographies are so rich that each would require their own retrospective to analyse. They exemplified auteur theory without even consciously putting it into practice. And in the West, it birthed the idea of a cinematic grandmaster, an artist that hones a singular and characteristic craft over many years. Cinema in the 1950s became the primary way in which Japan was able to recapture the national identity it had lost on the world stage in previous years. In 1958 alone, over 1.1 billion tickets were sold in Japanese cinemas, displaying the passion that the population had for its new burgeoning cinematic culture. Rather than seeking a political resurgence, they sought to affirm their soft power by regaining pride in their culture, as well as promoting that culture as best as they could to Western audiences. And the first true success in that realm came in cinema. The influence of 1950s Japanese cinema can't be underestimated. Even discounting the following decade in which many Japanese filmmakers were still making masterpieces, it was the emergence to the Western world and the reclaiming of its artistic sovereignty that remains the more powerful era. The samurai film gave birth to the spaghetti western, and the films were beyond influential in the developments of techniques within Western cinema. Gate of Hell was the first Japanese film to win the grand prize at the Cannes Film Festival. Again, another staple of the Jidaikai genre. And although it was these historical epics that were bringing more light to Japanese cinema on the main stage, there was still great variety in the film landscape of Japan. Back at Toho, although their main focus was the work of Kurosawa, they developed a new genre of film in 1954, a genre which still runs strong in Japan today. Inspired by a recent event involving a Japanese boat wherein the crew were contaminated by nuclear fallout, producer Tomoyuki Tanaka constructed a creature called Gojira, and Toho's newest focus became the giant monster or kaiju genre. Tanaka sought to combine the newer trend of American monster movies with the ever-present concerns about nuclear activity in Japan to develop these kaiju. Toho is still developing Gojira films to this day, having produced over 30, and during the 1950s added to their selection of monsters with Rodan and Varan. The lesser-known works of the decade have since been overshadowed by the simple fact that they've been competing with these absolute monoliths of cinema. Director Kon Ichikawa simply hasn't been able to match the exposure of someone like Mizoguchi, who like him was also at Daiei. But when looking at his work, The Burmese Harp was a major success at its time. As was Fires on the Plain, yet the inability to be held alongside their contemporaries of Japanese cinema most likely comes at the cost of his film's grisly nature. During the 1950s, Ichikawa was a director so unafraid to display how gratuitously bleak the war was, and how the Japanese had suffered for it. Its intensity can be matched by the likes of Come and See, but few others. And this is discussing the lesser-known directors. Mikio Naruse, who was alongside Kurosawa at Toho, made in the 1950s 5 different adaptations on the work of feminist writer Fumiko Hayashi, alongside around a dozen other separate films in this decade alone.
良い人と一生安らかにいたとて、一生この世の栄養を尽くしたとて、所詮は旅でする身の上だもの。
However, it was these seminal adaptations which gained him the reputation as the preeminent director of women. With most of his protagonists being female, he was the counterbalance to the work of Ozu, painting a picture of the broken family and unfulfilled desires. Yet his work still focused on the concept ever present in Ozu's work of mono no aware, or the pathos of things. The fact of the matter is, we can sit here and talk endlessly about the decade in its entirety, and I've barely scratched the surface. We could devote an entire dissection of the work of Kobayashi, Honda, Tsuburaya, but each of the artists mentioned here deserves their own retrospective. Although Japanese cinema ran strong throughout the following decade, I believe that the golden age runs throughout the 1950s, ceasing at the arrival of the 1960s. The fall of the Golden Age emerges with the rise of Japan's first major outsider movement, the Japanese New Wave. And here we have artists who actively rejected the aesthetics and thematics of their predecessors, with an aim to transgress and reimagine what Japanese cinema could be. But such is the nature of art. Even as the Japanese New Wave ran strong and made a name for some of the nation's most forward-thinking artists, the legacy of the 1950s remained a landmark for its cinema on an international scale. You could spend your entire study of cinema on this decade alone, and it wouldn't be time wasted. The 1950s cinema of Japan is an era which is perceived in a myriad of different ways. Many remember it as the era of the samurai film, which it was, but it was also the cinema of the humanist family drama, the technicolor epic, the transcendental tale, the monster blockbuster. It was all of these things, and so much more. It was a golden age, because it showed cinema as a catalyst for a people that had had so much taken away from them, a cinema which emphasised the sheer abundance of its quality in the most varied way possible. That cinema was to be led by its grand masters, and it was their works that could fill the cinemas. That film was led by ingenuity. If nothing else, the golden age of Japanese cinema can show us the pinnacle of what cinema can achieve and the standard we should continue to strive for.